Anushka, you can start.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, I warmly welcome you to the third thematic panel for our 15th flagship All India Conference of China Studies. The conference is being organized by ICS in partnership with the Indian Institute of Technology, Guwahati, the Guwahati University, the Omio Kumar Institute of Social Change and Development, and the India office of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. I, Anushka Saxena, am working with ICS as a research intern and I shall be the MC for the session today. The theme of the conference this year is Connected Geographies and Cultural Interfaces. This particular session will focus on the theme China, India, and Southeast Asia Policies and Perspectives. Without further ado, allow me to introduce our eminent panelists. Joining us as chair is Ambassador Ashok Kantha, Honorary Fellow and former Director, Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, and former Ambassador of India to China. Joining us as speaker is Professor Dickey Lama, who is Assistant Professor with the Department of Political Science at the Women's College, Calcutta. The topic of her presentation is Tianxia and Kyaukpyu, Spheres of Influence and Connection between China and Myanmar. Joining us also as speaker is Ms. Shruti Day, who's a doctoral candidate at the Department of Politics and International Studies, School of Social Sciences and International Studies, Pondicherry University. The topic of her presentation is China's rise and the hedging strategies of India and Vietnam in perspective. Joining us also as speaker is Ms. Swagata Saha, who is a doctoral candidate at the School of International Studies, Symbiosis International, deemed to be University, Pune. The topic of her presentation is the Pok factor in India's Act East policy. And this paper has been co-authored with Dr. Sukalpa Chakrabarti, Deputy Director and Associate Professor of IR and Public Policy at the School of International Studies, Symbiosis International, deemed to be University, Pune. Joining us as discussant for the session is Professor Manorma Sharma, who is a retired professor from the Department of History, Northeastern Hill University, Shillong, and is an academic advisor to the Assam Institute of Mass Communication and Media Research in Guwahati. The speakers will be allotted 15 to 18 minutes to make their presentations. The complete bios of our speakers can be perused in the conference brochure on our website, and I shall also share the same on the chat box. Before we initiate the proceedings of the session, I request the audience to follow some housekeeping rules. All participants are requested to stay muted during the presentations. Questions and comments can be posted in the chat box at any time during the event, or one can raise their Zoom virtual hand during the interactive session. Please unmute yourself only when called upon by the facilitator or the chair of the session to do so. Without further ado, I hand over the floor to Ambassador Kantha to take the proceedings forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Anushka, for your introductory remarks. Let me begin by thanking Professor Shobri Mitra and other colleagues at ICS for asking me to chair this very important thematic panel on China, India, and Southeast Asia policies and perspectives. As you are aware, Southeast Asia is an area of great interest to us. Historically, as also during the contemporary period. It's also an area where the footprints of India and China coincide. And that has been the case in the past and continues to be the case today as well. It's a reason which is becoming of even greater importance now as a primary theater for escalating strategic contestation between China and the USA. To help us understand the ongoing dynamics in the region, we have three excellent papers. Two of them focus on Myanmar and one on Vietnam. And we have, as Anushka mentioned, Professor Manorma Sharma as discussant. I'll begin with a paper by Dickey Lama, Assistant Professor, Department of Political Science, Women's College, Kolkata. Dickey has explored a very interesting theme where she looks at Kyaukpyu and the development of port there by China in the context of the Chinese narrative of Tianxia. Without much ado, I'll invite Dickey to make her presentation. I'll request her to limit her presentation to about 15 minutes so that we have enough time after 3 presentations and comments by Professor Sharma for Q&A session. Over to you, Dickey.
A very good afternoon to everybody present here. Before beginning this presentation, I would like to thank ICS and IIT Guwahati for giving up this very wonderful platform to discuss these ideas. It's been very enriching. And I was wondering if I could switch off my video. There's some problem with the bandwidth. So I'll just keep my audio on and share my screen, if that is okay. Is that okay,
please,
sir?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. The topic I will be talking about today is Tianxia and Kyaukpyu. I have made a few changes and revised a few ideas as suggested in the review. So the topic is Tianxia and Kyaukpyu, a narrative for Myanmar. Tianxia, the concept translates into an all under heaven concept. It is an idea which is a cosmological imperial concept. And the idea has seen revival in Chinese foreign policy and has become the focus of debate and scholarship in public discourse. The proposed paper seeks to analyze the concept of the Kyaukpyu port of Myanmar. The state of Myanmar is strategically important for China to gain access to the Indian Ocean region. And the narrative of the Chinese dream and Tianxia is constructed by China to propagate the Belt Road Initiative, extending its spheres of influence. So here, Tianxia becomes a rhetorical offensive for developing Chinese soft power. So there are these norms, there are frames and ideas which are reinvented to maximize interest as states attempt to reinvent their identities or even alter the existing international order. In 2013, Yang Shuitong, while interpreting Sun Tzu's philosophy, wrote about the goal of China's rise. So he contrasts hegemony to human authority and tyranny while discussing questions that have occupied the scholarly work on China at large. What kind of a superpower would China become? In its white paper on
I think we have lost Professor Dickey, so oh, she's back.
Yeah, Dickey, are you back?
Someone, please. Yes, I'm back. Can you also see my screen?
Please continue.
I'm very sorry. So the Chinese government has not yet been able to make a building or a human authority for the goal of its strategic ascent, Yang Shuitong says. Now, the goal of China's ascent is to aspire to become a better model society. So it has concepts like the Beijing Consensus, which it posited against ideas such as the Washington Consensus. And the Chinese world order, posited against the West, thus needs its own philosophical narrative. So here we see a revival of the concept of Tianxia in the contemporary period. Now, the rise or ascent of China, as we have seen from the century of humiliation to the Opium Wars, have been assessed by different schools and different ideas with different ontological underpinnings, epistemological underpinnings, but all agree that there has been an expansion in agent structures, the powers of the PRC in the last few decades. Schomburg writes of 7 different schools. I have been tracing the development of China, the evolution of China since its 1970 reforms, the 1970 reforms where it opposed great power competition, creating its own sphere of influence. 1972 Shanghai Communique, in 1991 where we have the new international order, and this was the beginning of China's, beginning of the construction of China's threat among the realists in the United States. So realist conceptions of foreign policy centered around state-centered insecurity, search for power, all of this created China as a threat. Yang Shuitong considered the partnership with the United States as weak and dangerous, and Huntington went further to create a hypothetical situation of inevitable clash of civilizations between the US and China. So the realists have theorized the rise of China leading to an hegemonic war, while the liberals argue incorporation into the existing system. Alternatively, China has been creating its own narrative which was discussed by Yang Shutong and Sheng Lijiang as a peaceful development in the Bao Forum as China's alternative to the Davos World Economic Forum. The Chinese dream is an idea rejuvenated to delegitimize the existing international order. This concept has also been taken forward by various scholars like Xiao Tingyang, Yuri Pines, Callahan, and Amitav Acharya, where we discuss how the Chinese have constructed their own narrative for their ascent, which can be symbolized using the Belt and Road Initiative. So the paper uses a critical discourse analysis where we see the agents of the states as conscious of certain interests, ideas, and values that are interdependent with cultural aspects, ideology, and philosophy of the region. The material factors thus only have meaning which is given to them by these actors. It is also use a two-level analysis where the analysis and acceptance of policies are not just by other states, but also need to be legitimized domestically. So the rise of China makes its diplomacy more relevant to the public, and the complex ideas of nationalism and legitimacy also come about here. Susan Shirk in 2008 has remarked that Chinese state is walking a tightrope of needing and containing this nationalism. The domestic agency of foreign policy leads to an analysis of the Chinese dream. So we have an imagined future after the century of humiliation, a narrative of norms, identities of an ancient civilization, creating a logic of images, a perception of China that supports its rise and creates a behavioral profile of a harmonious world against a threat to global international peace and order. So the study locates the use of Tianxia as a concept in the Chinese dream and the vocabulary surrounding it. These historical connections with Myanmar as it created in an imperial sense have been revived and subsumed under the nation-state framework. Now, Ching also talks about the construction of China as, talking about having a shared culture, history, which prevents the emergence of a security dilemma. And Fairbank also talks about how China becomes the center of the region. And there is a construction of the past within the nation-state framework to use a self-image. So imagined or not, this past or this construction would be the foundation for a rising China working towards rejuvenation or the Chinese dream. Myanmar was a tributary state under the Chinese imperial dynasties, and they are also seen to be placed under this all under heaven umbrella. So there is an overemphasis of the interest that Chinese have in Myanmar, especially because it resolves their Malacca dilemma. Tianxia, the next section talks about Tianxia as a construction for the Chungo, where we obviously discuss the revival of the concept in Chinese foreign policy. But the first time the concept is mentioned in the Chao dynasty, where the Chao use the concept to legitimize their authority as a virtuous empire against a very strong Shang dynasty, which lost its mandate to heaven due to its degeneracy. So it has a moral appeal, which invests a lot of cultural authority, pacifying subversive forces. The engagement here again, as Fairbank has created in 1968, is a concentric arrangement. So we have the Sinic zone at the center, the inner Asian zone and the outer zone, which becomes the Chinese cultural area. And the engagement is with China in the center with the regions, in its concentric arrangement. So we have this engagement is not of sovereign equals, but it is of subordination. And this is symbolized by the offering of tribute and rituals such as the Kantha. The Chao had won heaven's approval with their outstanding virtue. And we see it first mentioned in Shangshu, the Book of Documents, where after which we see the concept has transformed, but retained its centrality in rituals and virtue. And it is passed on from the spring and the autumn periods to the warring state period. And finally, when Chao Tingyang revives it for using it in contemporary China or contemporary China's engagement with the world. The Han dynasty also had developed a tributary system to maintain control over the barbarians from the civilized center. So we have China as a center and its engagement in the culture area through tributes. So the Sinocentric order was destroyed with the introduction of nation-state systems and when it clashed with the West. So previously, the powers which had suzerain vassal relations were now signing unequal treaties with Western powers, taking us to the construction or to the People's Republic of China today. The People's Republic of China has had its own share of narratives to develop an identity. We start with Deng Xiaoping's socialism with Chinese characteristics, Hu Jintao's harmonious society, and then a cultural fever which takes us back again to Confucianism. Then today it is through Xi's concepts like community of shared future for mankind and Chinese rejuvenation as it enters into the world stage. The use of such vocabulary and continued constructions of China's identity
I think we lost Professor Dickey again.
Mm.
We'll try to reach out to her.
Yeah,
just
just I think she's coming back. Yeah.
Yeah, I seem to be have disconnected again, but it has
Yeah.
nothing
Please,
to do
please, Dickey, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, my Wi-Fi seems fine, but anyway.
Yeah,
So
I think Dickey, you let move quickly. Come to
okay, sir.
Kyaukpyu
Okay,
as
sir,
early as
okay.
you can. You have only
Yes,
5
sir.
minutes left.
Okay, sir. So we're talking about the construction of China's identity, and we see that through a lot of speeches by the leadership, and we have ideas such as, enriching the intellectual and cultural lives of the people, enhancing the cohesion of the Chinese nation, and finally, for China to play a greater role in global governance. Now, this could only be possible if the existing liberal order and is delegitimized. So China posits its win-win or community for shared future or Tianxia against this already existing liberal international order. China's development has been possible because of the world. So he talks about a win-win strategy, and this win-win strategy and the community for shared future was first discussed in Moscow in 2013, also in 2015, where she has very clearly said that he sees hegemonism as a threat. In 2020, we see China and Myanmar agree to expand ties and expand cooperation with the then State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, where BRI and CFSM were discussed. So we have the construction of a deep sea port in Kyaukpyu with a 2.7 billion industrial area, which connects Yunnan to Kyaukpyu and giving China access to the Indian Ocean. The last section of my paper talks about Tianxia 2.0 in Kyaukpyu. This revival of Tianxia, as we see, is China's engagement with Myanmar. In 1993, with the construction of the Jiegao Bridge, a monument had been carved on the words, "Unite, blaze paths, and forge ahead." In 25 years, China has forged its way into Myanmar. China has transpired as Myanmar's largest trading partner, ally, and supplier of military hardware. We see the Hu Jintao administration, which talks about a peaceful development rhetoric, but Xi's Chinese dream leads us to the BRI, the regional organizations such as the Asian Development Bank, the BRICS, which seem to have challenged the liberal international order. Now, in its imperial context, rising powers and ambitions challenging the international order has led to a lot of questions where there are this debt trap diplomacy. We've all seen the economic crisis in Sri Lanka that happened in 2022. Now, Myanmar in 2017 has signed a memorandum of understanding. The relationship between the two countries is seen as mutually beneficial. They have had a relationship of a suzerain vessel before. And when we assess the historical connections, we see how the Yunnan dynasty and the Kublai Khan, he had sent emissaries to the pagan empire demanding tribute. And when they refused, he sent invasions, seized territories. We have the Ming dynasty losing land to the Tungo, and the Qing dynasty finally challenging the Konbang dynasty. So, however, Myanmar has been historically paying tribute to China. So we have the tributes carried out in a ritual form. This was a presentation for the barbarians as a sign of their admission to the civilization of the Middle Kingdom. Contact with China could only be on China's terms. Today, the relationship is described as a POC4 relationship. It has been called a marriage of convenience. It is uneven, asymmetrical. There have been many, many phases in this relationship. It is based on the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, the 5 principles, as we will discuss, I think, in the next paper that will be presented. And but China has always stood by Myanmar, prevented human rights resolutions. Myanmar's largest trading partner is China today, and China is interested because it connects China to the Indian Ocean. There's also a talk of the Southern Silk Route, and this is certainly where Robert Kaplan's 21st century rivalry will play out in the Indian Ocean region. This region has been subject to a lot of other narratives during the Cold War, which is like power vacuum, reciprocal escalation. Today, the ideas of Chinese dream and Tianxia certainly seem to signify a paradigm shift in the international order. Now, this is my last slide. I would like to talk about the Kyaukpyu Special Economic Zone, which resolves the Malacca dilemma for the Chinese. As an alternative, Gwadar port seems to be important, but because of its seasonal changes, it is not as favorable for transport to the Chinese as the Myanmar-Yunnan corridor. Now, as a response to this, there have been many engagements in the region to contain or restrict the influence of China, such as the Quad. There has been US interest in the Indo-Pacific. There has been political instability inside Myanmar, which becomes a problem for these two relationships. Nevertheless, China keeps investing a lot of money, having a power investment for oil and gas pipelines, interest-free loans, support against Western sanctions. There is a saffron support in the saffron revolution, the Cyclone Nargis, they helped Myanmar. There is a government-to-government engagement, a party-to-party engagement, and obviously the carrot stick policy to fight with its internal issues. The narrative here, when we come to the China and Myanmar engagement with Tianxia, is that there's a building of a narrative with 3 cognitive frameworks. First, first is the national rejuvenation, which is talking about restoring China's wealth and power. Secondly, the idea of a global community promoting mutual benefit. And lastly, the Chinese contribution, creating a potential Chinese model of international system, which is posited against the Western liberal order. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dickey, for that presentation. Dickey brought out in some detail evolution, the concept of Tianxia through Chinese history and its present deployment, not only as an instrument for an imagined past, but as she put it, also for imagined future. And then she connected it to China-Myanmar relations, and more specifically, Kyaukpyu port as a manifestation of Tianxia 2.0, as she put it. Thank you for your presentation. We'll now move to our next speaker, Shruti Day. Shruti, as Anushka introduced her, is doctoral candidate with the Pondicherry University, and she'll be speaking on China's rise and the hedging strategies of India and Vietnam in perspective. Over to you, Shruti. Please try to make your presentation about 15 minutes.
Thank you, sir. First, I would like to thank the Institute of Chinese Studies for giving me this opportunity to present my topic in this platform. So without any further delay, I would like to start with the presentation. Is my screen visible?
Yeah, it's visible. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So the name of my topic is China's rise and the hedging strategies of India and Vietnam in perspective. The significance of this topic is that, for a long time in the domain of realism, we have studied the behavior of state from the perspective of balance of power, in specific to balancing and bandwagoning dichotomy. But after the in the post-Cold War times, where we have seen that there is ambiguity in alignment choices among the states, and how states have been mostly focusing on profit maximizing and managing their risk in the ever-altering global politics. So the hedging strategy has come into play. So first, I will start with a brief introduction and the scope of it, my understanding of hedging perspective. And thirdly, I will bring in the topic of India and Vietnam. So without any further delay, I will start. So as we all know, the theories of international relation, in particular, realism was obsessed with the study of the behavior of great powers and their competition. And as Kenneth Waltz has noted in his theory of structural realism, that bipolarity in the world gives more stability than compared to multipolarity, because it is instability infused. So, but however, in the 1990s, we saw there was an end of bipolarity, the brief emergence of rise of unipolar post-world order with US hegemony, and followed by multipolarity in the world order, especially after China's rise in the 2000s. And somewhere down the line, the balancing bandwagoning dichotomy has failed to explain why do states behave the way they behave. Yeah, so because according the definition of balancing is that states align with weaker power to against a eminent power. And in the case of bandwagoning, it is states align with a stronger power, the threatening power, to at the expense of their autonomy, so that it doesn't targets them in the longer run. For also for the purpose of profit maximization or territorial gain. So state used to either balance or bandwagon. But after the post Cold War, this kind of the unambiguous situation of alignment choices stopped, and clearly stopped, because the world was no longer bipolar and states started to live in a multipolar world. Yeah, so that's where the alternative options which were availed by the state is the strategy of hedging. So the strategy of hedging is pursued when profits and risk are equally high. And the aim of my study is to understand the existing theoretical underpinnings of hedging, and then follow with three important questions, which is why India and Vietnam have adopted the strategy of hedging, how they have done it, and at lastly, has it been successful so far? So, understanding the theoretical underpinnings of hedging, as earlier I have spoken about how balancing and bandwagoning dichotomy has become insufficient to provide an explanation. Okay, and the crisis, especially after the 1997 economic crisis in Southeast Asia, has pushed the Southeast Asian states in particular, towards hedging, because they don't want to lose their profits at the face of China's rise, building economic ties with China. At the same time, they wanted the strategic presence of US in the region. So that's why they have sought for the strategy of hedging. Now I have made a small diagram towards the right. It's that it tries to explain that the alignment choices between country A and B are very clear. It's either balancing or bandwagoning. But as the degree of ambiguity in global politics starts to rise, so the strategy for hedging, the demand for strategy of hedging also starts to rise, because states cannot clearly define that who are their threats and what are the risks which are prevailing in the global scenario. And at the same time, states, especially the middle states, do not have the relative capability to even fight with the eminent power. So that's why strategy of hedging becomes viable in this situation. Now, coming to the theoretical portion, I have gone through the existing literature of Evelyn Goh, Chen Chui Quick, Kai Kogam. So this I have divided into thematic panels. So firstly, the above three mentioned names. So those prominent scholars have placed the strategy of hedging within the alignment choice, and they have defined it between It's a middle strategy between pure balancing and pure bandwagoning. And they have added many dynamic elements to the strategy of hedging, like which is economic pragmatism, binding engagement, that is engaging the eminent power within multilateral institutional bindings, limited bandwagoning, and also internal capability building, that is indirect balancing, by forging by building the internal military capability and by forging external strategic ties with eminent powers. But others like John D. Seorseri and Ogan Hick have highlighted that hedging is too loosely defined, because the definition of hedging in itself is still now evolving in nature. So nobody has come to a perfect conclusion that what are the elements of hedging and what it should constitute. What is the proper way of defining hedging? So John Seorseri has said that hedging is not an alignment choice. So he has completely differed from Evelyn Go and Quick. So he said that hedging is a mechanism to reduce risk and optimization of reward of security cooperation. Okay, so it neither means that hedging deeply means it's based on extensive military buildup, or is it only states hedge only against those nations who are extensively feared. And thirdly, Jogan Hake has differed from above two thinkers, and he has said that till date, hedging has been so much associated with balancing that the line between balancing and hedging has not been demarcated. So he has said that he has denoted hedging as risk management strategy, as risks are more probabilistic in nature and threats are more possibilistic in nature. So he has distinguished between risk and threats. So he has said that and hedging is not a strategy to mitigate threats, but to mitigate risk. So although, like I have said, a common consensus is yet to develop, but the debate over the definition of hedging is still going on. But based on my understanding, I have highlighted certain points on hedging which can be agreed upon unanimously. First, it is that the strategy of hedging is pursued by any lesser power towards a greater power. And the stimulant towards the pursuance of hedging in this case is the threat perception. The threat perception of a middle or an emerging state towards an eminent power that in the future they can come under attack of the eminent power. Secondly, it is mostly practiced to manage risk emanating from great power competition. Like I have said, that how the Southeast Asian region has become a theater of US China competition in the current times. And we have also seen that how China has reacted in Taiwan's issue after Nancy Pelosi has visited Taiwan. Then the subcategory of this second point is that the factor of geographical proximity. The factor of geographical proximity has played a very predominant role in India's and Vietnam's hedging strategy, because both of them had a past history of war with China. So that's why it becomes a very stimulating factor in India's and Vietnam's hedging strategy. Third is neither all weather friendly nor a fail proof strategy. So hedging, though the states who pursue hedging, they are very well aware that at one point of time it is not going to keep them safe from the direct threats which approximate eminent power can pose. So that time the state might go into a mode of protecting their sovereignty rather than thinking of hedging in a very diplomatic way at that particular period of time. Fourth, it also means diversification of relation, as the alignment choices for the hedging state is very ambiguous. So that's why they tend to diversify their relation by making multiple fallback options by diversifying their military, economic and political relation with other states. Then, subset to the diversification of relation, states leaders' perception of risk management is also an important factor, because it also depends on how the state leaders perceive the conception of hedging, and also the risk managing factor is also important. And the last point is there is no outward announcement of hedging. So like no state, they will announce in their policy documents or white papers that they are hedging towards a preeminent power, because this might invite uninvited attention and followed by an aggression in this course. So coming to the threat perception, which I have already spoken about, is that it is anticipation of harm of either one material asset or belief system, which is backed by an act of recognition. And the factors for past enmity is enmity is clashes. I mean, factors for threat perception is the past enmity, clashes, competition frequently, which creates an ecosystem of suspicion, hostility for the present relation, and which enhances the perception of threat. Now, when it comes specifically to India and Vietnam, both the countries are constrained by the tyranny of geography, because China is their northern neighbor, and India has already faced China's aggression not only in 1962 but 1988 in Arunachal Pradesh, and also recently in 2017 and 20 as well. And in the case of Vietnam, it's the worst affected country in the Southeast Asian region when it comes to China's aggression, both on land boundary and also maritime boundaries. And recently now, even Vietnam is facing the threats uh, of water, like because China is constructing a lot of dams, because China is being an upper riparian country in the Mekong, it controls the flow of the Mekong river by constructing more of them. So Vietnam, two districts of Vietnam has recently faced drought-like condition because of China's unilateral actions. Now, the first question is why India and Vietnam are hedging against China. First point is hedging provides both the countries to diversify relation and reduce overdependence, because that can offer them with building their internal capability, and also at the same time become more economically stable by diversifying their relation. The second point is explicit balancing and bandwagoning will be detrimental in today's time, where we know the side effects of balancing and bandwagoning, because ultimately you have to suffer a nation has to suffer the consequences of explicit balancing and bandwagoning, which ultimately leads to the loss of autonomy and sovereignty. Okay, so these nations are do not the emerging power and the middle state do not want to explicitly balance or bandwagon. Third is the element of complex interdependencies. Now, we know that China is the largest trading partner of India and Vietnam at the same time, and also at the same time, India, like the Asian Infrastructure Bank of China, has invested over 35 projects in India. The same is so with Vietnam. Vietnam is a member of China's BRI, but it had been cautious about China's investment in Vietnam, given to the debt trap diplomacy, and they do not want to over rely on China on these aspects of infrastructure investment.
Ms. Day, sorry to interrupt you. Could you please conclude in 2 to 3 minutes?
Yeah, sure. The fourth is India has a vital strategic interest in South China Sea, and Vietnam serves as an important partner for India. As David Brewster has quoted that Vietnam is the diamond in South China Sea because of vital energy, trade, and also strategic interests. So that's why there is an overlap of there is a coming together of in strategic interests of India and Vietnam. Now, how has India and Vietnam hedged against China? Firstly, through binding engagement, because both the countries engage with China in different multilateral platforms, ASEAN, there comes BRICS, then linking Mekong cooperation, and these platforms act as a these platforms gives the country both the countries a platform to interact with China. Second, Vietnam has reassured China through its no policy. First, no military alignment, no uh, foreign military base can be allowed in Vietnam. Use of not differing from use of force or threatening to use of force. Third, on various occasions, India has stressed on maintaining its strategic autonomy, and its actions are not directed against any country. So the last question is, how has India and Vietnam been successful in their hedging strategies? As stated earlier, the strategy of hedging is risk management strategy and does not lead to the complete elimination of threat. Now, in the case of India, there exists a hierarchy of interests, strategic preferences, and influences that are capable of fluctuating. And at this moment, it's the border contention which tops the hierarchy. Although India's threat perception towards China is going to be more hard-hitting, but this aspect doesn't diminish the possibilities of exploring the positive cooperation in different domains. Here, I like to point out that after seeing India's hedging strategy towards China, so apart from the economic pragmatism and binding engagement, so but the border issues will be a bone of contention until and unless the border issues are not resolved mutually. So I don't think so hedging as a strategy will be fruitful for India to solve border contentions, because this will keep on coming up even in the future. Now,
Shruti,
when it
can
comes
you wrap it up now?
yes, sir. Like, this is the last slide. Now, when it comes to Vietnam, we know that how China's maritime assertions have been troubling Vietnam, and recently, in April 2020, China has announced 2 administrative zones in Parsley and Spratly Islands. So, China has been has raised objections against Vietnam's oil exploration projects in South China Sea. So far, Vietnam has managed China's assertive behavior through bilateral dialogues and binding engagement. But yes, it's true that India and Vietnam are pursuing their strategy of hedging against China. But given the altering nature of global politics, it is too early to come to a conclusion that hedging is an answer to all kind of threats. So I like to make just 2 small points. Firstly, through the strategy of hedging, nations get the opportunity to diversify their capabilities, and that is a way to build up their self-help. And second is that the strategy of hedging is not an answer to all kind of threats, especially which is something related to boundary issue or maritime issue. So I like to leave this here and like to hear comments from the audience. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Shruti. Thank you for your presentation. Shruti argued that balancing bandwagoning dichotomy is not sufficient strategy in post-Cold War period, and that strategy of hedging is more relevant and viable for countries like India and Vietnam. She went into the issue of debate on definition of hedging and the fact that there's no agreed definition. At the same time, she brought out elements of hedging, and then she went on to see how India and Vietnam have utilized hedging and to what extent they have been successful in managing their threat perception vis-a-vis China. Thank you for your presentation. I'm sure we'll have more questions on that. We'll now turn to our third speaker, Swagata Saha of Symbiosis International University, Pune. Swagata and Sukalpa Chakrabarti have prepared this paper on POC4 fact in India's actist policy. I'll invite Swagata to make her presentation.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, Chair, the panelists and participants. I would like to thank ICS for giving me and Dr. Chakrabarti the opportunity to present this paper and be part of this excellent epistemic community. Chair, if may I have your permission for seamless presentation and connectivity, I would like to keep my video off while PPT presentation.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. So without any delay, I would directly go to the introductory part of our topic. Yes, I hope my slides are visible. I just turn into full screen mode.
Yeah, please make it full screen.
Yes.
Yeah, now it's full screen.
Yes. So the topic of our presentation is POC4 factor in India's actist policy. For most of you who know, but some of you who may be non-starter to this, that POC4 means in Myanmarese language, in Burmese language, a brotherly friendship between China and Myanmar. So Myanmar, as we all know, is positioned at the crossroads of South Asia and Southeast Asia and has been the stepping stone of India's eastward ambitions. The military junta in Myanmar had found in China a timely friend through the years of embargo and sanctions. Despite being heavily economically dependent on China, Myanmar is wary of China's development and often debt trap. In India's endeavors to maintain natural leadership in South Asia and China's rising claims into this region, Myanmar acts as a countervailing ground. Set against this kind of a background, this paper would analyze the salience and implications of India-Myanmar brotherly relations for India's activist iteration of foreign policy. Connectivity and citizenship are going to be the issues through which I will compare and understand what are the implications for Indian foreign policy. The year of 1990s came with reconfigured world political situation and new possibilities for India. With the end of Cold War, bipolar division of world was over, non-alignment and Asian conference sounded superfluous, and the new international economic order could no longer hold ground. The once heightened friendship between Jawaharlal Nehru and UNO, inked through the Treaty of Friendship in 1951, dwindled. Therefore, India needed new terms and mechanisms of engagement in Southeast Asia. For India, it was the untapped zone of resources, strategic might, and cooperative potential. Lucist policy of 1992 turned to its actist iteration in 2014. It was not just a change of nomenclature, but a testimony to changing contours of geopolitics of the region. Actist as a policy at that time had to compete and coexist with other foreign policies like China's OBOR, One Belt, One Road, US's pivot to Asia, or Japan's China 1+1 plan. Myanmar, in this context, must occupy a more singular space in the foreign policy from its present accommodation in the CLMV conglomerate, which is the Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. India and Myanmar have had civilizational ties. Colonialism for India and Myanmar has been as much derogatory as foreign domination, which is dubbed as Year of Humiliation by China. Now I'll move on to the first variable, which is citizenship. As Blumrad and others puts it, citizenship is integral to tension between inclusion and exclusion. India's Northeast and Myanmar have had a perforated border. Historically, the Mizos across the border, India and Myanmar, I mean, as well as the people of Kachin and Sagaing division, feel more at one with each other than maybe sometimes with the citizens of Delhi or Naypyidaw. In the course of a field visit to a bordering town, Champhai in Mizoram, I have observed that it was fascinating that Myanmar's pupils traveled and studied in Indian schools in the day, studying Indian curriculum and singing Indian national anthem in the ceremonial prayers. It was also observed that the vernacular translation of the word foreign in local language was Burmathil, as Burma or Myanmar continued to be its gateway to foreign countries of Mizoram. In 1994 border trade agreement, which was signed between India and Myanmar, aimed at a facilitation of resource-based interaction of people living at the borders. Coming to the next problem is the Rohingya problem, which we often refer to as the stateless people, the boat people, or the settlers of Bhasanchar. They find no space in the enlisted ethnic minorities under the Burmese national law of 1982. Although India and Indian civil society organizations have been instrumental in providing aid to Rohingyas, however, this has been as far as accommodating them in the homeland is concerned, it has been far from reality. Rohingyas have not been covered by India's most coveted humanitarian refuge program, the Citizenship Amendment Act 2019. However, Indian indifference to the Rohingya issue will certainly bring India's natural leadership of South Asia and advances to Southeast Asia under doubts. Rohingyas in Myanmar are subsumed under the category Bengali outsiders, unless they can provide the evidence that their ancestors have arrived earlier than 1823. However, it was not just Rohingyas, even many Indians were expelled following the Nevin's military coup in 1962, which encouraged xenophobia and a somewhat myopic Burmanization of the then political economic milieu of the country. As India is not signatory to 1951 UN Convention of Refugees, it is not obligatory for India to give refuge to these unauthorized migrants. We must realize here there was no Aung San Suu Kyi like charismatic character or a primordial connect like the Sri Lankan issue, which could earn this a strategic mileage. In the past, many Indian leaders and supporters of the pro-democracy movement in Myanmar, like Rajiv Gandhi, P.N. Haskar, George Fernandez, is believed to have lent material and meaningful encouragement to All Burma Student League and India-Burma Friendship Society. China has also been home to persecuted minorities of Myanmar. Yunanese merchants, particularly interested in jade, have traded and thronged Mandalay in Myanmar. According to Agritu, economic pursuit and religious persecution in Myanmar has been the prime drivers of emigration of Muslim minority of Myanmar to adjoining China, who were often looked down upon as useful neighbors or essential outsiders by the local Chinese community. In fact, Chaco and Davis very interestingly puts that it is the territorial defense of nation that lies at the heart of citizenship. Concluding on this point, citizenship is the battleground among the countries with unsettled ethnic linkages where political and primordial border do not run parallel. The we-they distinction is well entrenched and often aggregated by Beijing's command structure, Burmese chauvinism, or Indian right-wing populism or selective ostensible humanitarian efforts. This part of South and Southeast Asia, which is a major source of brain drain, have, however, themselves not embraced modern, cosmopolitan, or post-national definitions of citizenship. I'll move on to my second variable, connectivity. Connectivity has claimed to be the new meta pattern of our times. This is where the de jure world of political borders is found to be leading to the de facto world of functional connectedness. In modern history, it was during the Second World War that the Allied forces needed a road from China to India via Myanmar as an alternative communication route in face of Japanese overpowering the eastern coast of China. This is how the Burma Road and Ledo Road were constructed as wartime roadworks, popularly now known as the Stillwell Road. The short map on the screens shows the Ledo Road. The OBOR initiative the Burma Road or BCIM initiatives all seem to interject one another at the old paths of Silk Route, Horse Route, Tree Route, and the like. In the context of this region, connectivity and citizenship has been one another's fulfiller, as well as a countergrading ground for China and India to make their presence resonate in South and Southeast Asia. China and Myanmar share 2,200 kilometers border, large part of which is again porous. For People's Liberation Navy, Myanmar is a bypass route to Malacca Strait and springboard to Andaman Sea and Bay of Bengal, further till Indian Ocean. The Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar, BCIM, Greater Mekong Sub-Region GMS initiatives are developmental schemes based on sub-regional connectivity. As you can see on screen on your left, the economic core of BCIM is shown, which connects Kunming in Yunnan, passes through Yangon of Burma, Kolkata of India, before emptying itself through Bangladesh. Except for symbolic car rallies and some joint work group meetings, no much success have been achieved on this front. However, the fact that institutional arrangement is in place speaks volume about the importance and potential of this region. India and Myanmar has a 1600 kilometer line border, and Myanmar controlled islands are very close to Andaman and Coco Islands, key strategic outposts for India. India and Myanmar have decided to cooperate on many developmental and connectivity projects like the Trilateral Highway Project, the Tamu-Kaleva Road, the Taleva-Yargi Road. The Kaladan Multimodal Project is believed to provide sea lanes of communication to northeast through Myanmar. The Delhi-Hanoi Railway Link and the Mekong-India Economic Corridors will further integrate the above-mentioned regional projects. Moving on, in 2020, the then State Councillor of Myanmar, Aung San Suu Kyi, and President Xi Jinping witnessed the signing of 33 project MOUs during Xi's two-day visit to Myanmar under the broad name of China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. The right side map shows this corridor's representation. Cooperation sounds simpler than achieved when in a space of unsettled nationalities, intertwined primordial loyalties, difficult terrain, disturbed domestic politics, and where regime is often more powerful than the state. Therefore, concluding on my paper, I would like to say that India and China has remained reticent over few very pressing issues like the 2021 military takeover of democratic government in Myanmar, denying the democratic verdict of 2020 elections, large-scale persecution and execution of democracy protesters, or initial isolation of San Suu Kyi and arbitrary extension of the present military rule till 2023. Chinese economists' interests have always stayed ahead of any international obligation or humanitarian situation. Myanmar stands no exception to this rule. From Myanmar's perspective, it may seem so, but it is unlikely that even the Tatmadaw or the military junta will befriend China and desert India. To remain relevant in international politics is to have options. Let no one be completely sure of the power equilibrium. Since acting has taken over looking role in India's ambition eastward policy, Indian interest in Myanmar must not be guided by Chinese expansionism. India must engage in Myanmar by the singular reason of neighborhood policy. And I conclude my topic here. Thank you.
Thank you, Swagata, for your presentation. Swagata, presented a very interesting perspective on how Myanmar's POC factor influences India's activist policy, and she brought out several aspects of triangular engagement involving India, Myanmar, and China, focusing specifically on citizenship factor, where she offered a critique of Citizenship Amendment Act, how it doesn't cover the Rohingyas, and connectivity of Myanmar both with India and China. And she also, commented briefly on implications of recent developments in Myanmar for India's Act East policy. Thank you for your presentation. Now I'll turn to our discussant. We are very fortunate to have a very distinguished academic, Professor Manoma Sharma, offering her comments on the three papers. So I'll invite her to offer her comments in about 10-12 minutes. Over to you, Professor Sharma. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I'm audible?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I think we have had a very interesting afternoon of listening to three very diverse papers on China's existence and presence in Southeast Asia. I think it's interesting that to understand, or it is important also to remember that China's foreign policy itself has undergone various kinds of changes, sometimes through leaps and bounds, sometimes very quietly, and we see one has to look back into history, and perhaps we can go back to somewhere around 1954, the Geneva Conference, as one of the starting points where the China, which announced, and in fact the PRC announced that 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. But how how this changes from 1954 till we have the Xi Jinping thoughts of today. I think it's a very interesting evolution of China's looking at itself, at its neighbors, and the world relations at large. So I think in that context, I feel that each of these papers actually has that as a background against which to look at the Chinese interventions and the importance of the China's exercises in Southeast Asia. Now, these three papers, I will not go into a lot of what how I look at the Chinese foreign policy, but I think it's important to look at how the scholars have tried to project China's foreign policy and its engagements in Southeast Asia, because that is an engagement which is very, very relevant for India's foreign policy in various ways. Now, I think the Dickey Lama's paper, I think, needs to be discussed separately from the other two, in the context of that she goes back into history and tries to look at China's emerging foreign policy in the context of, say, a very old Chinese philosophy of Tianxia. Now, of course, and the other two papers have posed questions on China's policy prerogatives vis-a-vis India, Vietnam, and India, Myanmar compulsions and cooperations and strategies. And more importantly, I think the last paper tried to look at the very important India's foreign economic and also economic policy, that of Act East. In her paper, Lama tries to argue around the very ancient philosophy of Tianxia, and it appears that she's almost taken the cue from Chao Tianyang's 2005 attempt to revive the old Chao dynasty philosophy of harmonious coexistence. In this whole idea of all under heaven. Now, China's rise as here I have a little, I have a little difficulties in accepting her, totally accepting her line of argument. in the context that this whole the concept, the idea of all under heaven, Tianxia, that is something that emerges in a very feudal kind of a setup when there are the autocratic monarchies, and it could something almost be like a divine right of kings. So historically it is of a different historical period as such. So it would need, I feel, a lot of philosophical arguments to try and bring it forth to the 21st century, or even to the end of the 20th century, to see that how it can be revived, or how successfully it has been sought to be revived in the Chinese foreign policy. Now, the China's rise as an economic and military power provides the context for the revival of tradition and reinvention of the term Tianxia. Now, the Tianxia is constructed as the revival principle of a new Chinese world order. And the question that, as a historian, I would always like to ask that, is it possible to revive historically, an idea which has emerged in a historically totally different historical reality? Is it possible to revive it in exactly the same way in a new, in today's conditions? That is a question that has come up, and that I have been thinking about as I read her paper. And the idea of peaceful and harmonious coexistence, which underlies the idea of Tianxia, however, seems to be at odds with the present Chinese thrust in Southeast Asia. Now, if you talk about peaceful coexistence, or and put it in terms of the all under heaven, can this do? Can we really? This is perhaps I'm writing it to. Putting it to the scholar to think in terms of that, and perhaps go into a deeper, historical and philosophical understanding of this. And this whole idea, even if one wants to argue in favor, has to be seen in terms of how interactions between the Chinese and Southeast Asian governments have been shaped by ideological conflicts, competing nationalisms, clashes of struggles, clashes of clashes of strategic interests, as well as economic interdependence. And the BRI, or One Belt, One Road initiative, under that, it might find further, or it might further complicate the relations between China and neighboring countries in Southeast Asia. So I think, although her, Dickey Lama has taken up a very challenging idea of trying to look at, the Chinese foreign policy or Chinese intervention in Southeast Asia, and using perhaps ideas which are there in China, that they are trying to use an idea to justify their, their interventions and their, projections or their activities. I think we need to perhaps think about it a little more critically, and see whether it is. I think at the end of the paper she does say that it is. It's not perhaps possible in today's terms, but I think that idea needs to be looked at. And if you are using an idea, because the title is Tianxia, and obviously the expectation would be that this is either it will be a very strong critique of it, or it would be a justification of it. So I think that needs to be further, strengthened or further discussed in the presentation as she goes ahead. Now, coming to the other two papers, there is a more direct engagement, as I see it, with the realities of the Chinese existence with the countries of Southeast Asia and India. Now, Shruti has projected the cases of India and Vietnam, trying to engage with China on various institutional platforms. And she has mentioned the institutional platforms on which the engagement has been sought. The highlighting of the common threat perceptions from China for both India and Vietnam, and using the strategies of hedging and bandwagon to maintain a balance of power in the region is extremely interesting. And she has, of course, said that hedging is perhaps, balancing is something that is not possible in today's condition, and hedging perhaps is could be a more fruitful, or could be a more something that could be more practicable. And maybe one needs to also, have a broader definition of hedging, as she says. Now, in this exercise, it is necessary to put, I think, certain things in the perspective of the different attributes of India-China and Vietnam-China relations historically, and against the realities of the size, that is both in terms of geographical and population-wise, and emerging economic influences of the two countries, that is India and Vietnam. In this context, the little detailing of the changes in China from the Maoist ideological existence in the pre-1970s period to the post-Maoist developments through the, as I said, the 1954 Geneva Conference, the present-day thoughts of Xi Jinping regarding China's attitudes and interests would be very much in the line of assessing strategies like hedging and bandwagon approaches. Now, in this context, for both the papers of Shruti and Swagata Saha, I think it would be a very, 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 very revealing, or it would take them further into their works to understand the Chinese activities that shape or constrain the choices and options for local political and economic elites, because China's sheer size means that it will inevitably play a role in this, and a very important role in this geographic region. And it is, gradually one sees that there is an attempt to try and engage with the political elites of the region. Now, China is the world's, there is no doubt about it, it is the world's largest trader and manufacturer, and it sits on a significant pool of foreign exchange reserves and capitalist reserves and capital that countries like Vietnam, Myanmar, and also India will invariably wish to engage with. And they have to engage with this because this is a very strong emerging force and power in the region. Now, in the paper of Saha and Chakrabarti, they clearly enunciate the China factor in negotiating with the Act East policy. But surprisingly, in her presentation, the Act East policy found very little place. In her whole paper, as I read it, the Act East policy is definitely, is being discussed. But I think one would agree that in her presentation, she focused more on the China-Myanmar, complications and conflicts, etc., rather than coming to the Act East policy. But I think it is important that one has to look into the importance of Myanmar in India's context of the Act East policy. Now, China's interest in Myanmar is more concerned with territorial sovereignty, maritime jurisdiction in the South China Sea, or with their maritime connections, which remains a defining feature of contemporary China-Southeast Asia relations, because China, Yunnan, they want connectivity with, maritime connectivities. In the past 4 decades, the Chinese economy has experienced, as we know, unprecedented growth, which has enabled the country to export goods and services while propelling to search externally for consumers, markets, resources, supplies, etc. Now, since the early, 21st century, China has been transforming itself into an active global investor. Now, there is no doubt that Asia has been an important target region for investment by China. So it is only natural that it will have commercial and territorial interests in Myanmar. There is no doubt about it. But what I would like to project here is this, that in the context of India's Act East policy, does this Myanmar interest of China throw spanners in the way ahead of the Act East policy? I think that's the point, that if the paper has been mentioned as India's Act East policy, I think this issue needs to be discussed in much greater details. Because this is an issue which I feel needs more in-depth discussion in the context of socio-economic and political realities, particularly of Northeast India. Because Act East policy of India cannot be, we cannot engage with it without focusing on Northeast India. Without a welcoming atmosphere in Northeast India, the Look East policy did not achieve what was hoped. And the Act East policy may also face the same road bumps. So the base of the Act East policy has to be, how Northeast India is geared to meet the, meet the requirements and the challenges of the Act East policy. Now, if the China factor has to be focused, then perhaps it is necessary to discuss whether India will be a major threat to China in Southeast Asia in the context of markets, resources, and investments, because that is what the Act East policy is trying to move out and to try and spread out India's economy and influence, etc., to Southeast Asia. So I think these are factors which the paper does need to look into, and look into what is the, if Act East policy has to be fruitful, is it Myanmar or is it India's own organization of its economy, politics, etc., in Northeast India? I think that is an issue which we need to look into very carefully. But I must say that these three papers have presented some very interesting insights into how the Chinese presence in Southeast Asia, particularly as contesting on common grounds, so far as India is concerned, might be looked into both from the perspective of geopolitical interests, financial and economic investments, and also ethnic similarities and historical connections, because there is no doubt that there are a lot of historical and ethnic connections between parts of China and a part of the Southeast Asia and India's Northeast as well. So I think it has been a very, very in a way, a learning process for me also, and also a great thinking process listening to the papers. I congratulate the three paper presenters for their very articulate presentations and their very deep work, hard work that has gone into preparing these papers. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Professor Sharma, for those very constructive and insightful remarks on three papers. I believe your comments will greatly help the four scholars in fine-tuning and finalizing their papers. So thanks for those remarks. Let's now turn to questions in the chat box. Anushka, there's one question from Professor Lama. Would like to just read it out?
Yes. Yes, sir. There is a question from Dr. Manoranjan Mohanty for Dr. Dickey Lama.
Before that, before that, I'll ask Professor Mohanty to raise the question directly. There's one more question
from myself.
Yourself. Why don't you ask that question?
Sure, sir. Thank you. So my question was to Professor Lama. I had a two-part question, which was that, is it essential to view China's revival of ideology and invocation of Tianxia concept as attempts to create a new world order, or can these simply also be viewed as its attempts to make the existing world order more suitable for its rise? Additionally, what are your views on the idea that Xi Jinping has gone out of his way to create a hostile environment in China's neighborhood to use any moment of crisis to expand his own legitimacy? Thank you.
Thanks. Maybe we'll club some questions. So can I request Professor Manoj Mohanty to pose his question directly? Manu? Can you please unmute him?
Wait, sir, I'm on it. Professor Monty, you may try to unmute yourself.
Okay. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
It has been a very rich session. And as Manorama pointed out, I'm glad to see Manorama after a long time. This Tianxia has been a reference point during the last several years in foreign policy analysis in relation to China. But there are two very different interpretations of this Tianxia. That is, one, as if a Chinese monarch is considering, mostly his notion of mandate under heaven, and then everything under heaven. Okay, and the other is the earth under the heaven, the whole world under the heaven. And both these interpretations exist in Chinese literature and in and today. This is the debate. One is to very easy, and now because of Xi Jinping's very assertive foreign policy, the first, which is the Fairbank perspective on Sinocentric world order, and even Dickey Lama referred to Chungkuo in that concept. China, the Middle Kingdom, middle of the earth, and so on. Firstly, Chungkuo was not meant to mean that. It was a central kingdom surrounded by warring states, which were which was the centrally located kingdom, which defeated the surrounding states and created the larger state. And not as center of the universe, center of the earth at all. That was not the original meaning. But from the 19th century, and particularly after the Fairbank historiography, which became the dominant historiography on China and the world, the Sinocentrism became the reference point. And now, with an aggressive or assertive foreign policy under Xi Jinping, that is matching very well with the Fairbank perspective, you see. Yeah, and I agree that Xi Jinping has given credence to it by the way the BRI has been advanced, and several, the South China Sea, our own problems on the border, and so many other things. And the new sort of Sino-US relationship, as if the two of them have to, manage the world. Now, that is one view. The other view is, and Yen Sui-tung has not really contrasted these two views very well, but he implies them. But others should understand it more clearly. In the post-colonial world and after the Second World War, this is the debate. Is another hegemonic world tolerated by the rest of the world, by the 21st century world? Does it have to be, as the realists have been saying, that the it has to be a balance of practically nuclear terror or practically military power, and so on. So, therefore, the other meaning is that there has to be a harmonious world where contradictions are solved through dialogue, consultations, and various other ways. And hegemony of any type, domination of any type, national domination, one nation dominating over other, one race, one religion, one language, one caste, any kind of domination is under attack today. And that was the 1945 charter.
Manu, can you come to your question, please? Yeah.
So that is, therefore, would Dr. Lama and the others comment on this?
Okay. Thanks, Manu. I think we are running out of time now, only 5 minutes left. So Dickey would like to respond to two set of questions. I think Dickey is unable to unmute herself. Okay, is she co-host?
Yes, sir, but I'm on it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Dickey, go ahead. Please unmute yourself and respond very briefly because we don't have much time left.
Okay, sir. Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, to answer all the three ideas and doubts, I think there's been a miscommunication, or like my PPT was, we left the meeting during when I was discussing this. But I was not advocating for a peaceful, harmonious China, and that China is something called the all under heaven. I was discussing the narrative around this concept and how China has built it and, kept it parallel to the Chinese dream. There is certainly a lot of realpolitik involved here. And as ma'am asked, I do not believe that an ancient and archaic idea like Tianxia can be revived today. In fact, even in its imperial context, it has neither been peaceful, neither it has been harmonious. So we spoke about Kublai Khan and how, the pagan dynasty disintegrated. This imperial concept itself, I'm saying, finds revival in a lot of discussions today, as Professor Monti also speaks of. He's spoken about two ideas that revolve around this concept. One thinks of it like as a very peaceful integration of China into the existing world order. But as a modern nation state also, I do not think this imperial context is applicable, but that does not stop China from constructing this narrative of, legitimacy domestically as well as internationally here. The revival of the narrative places China, and it becomes a zero-sum game nevertheless. So there is delegitimization of the Western liberal international order and creating... So we have
Dickey, if you could conclude quickly. Yeah.
Yes, sir. So we have the Beijing consensus as against the Washington consensus. We have the Bao Forum as against the Davos Forum. So the rise of China here has suddenly seen a lot of contradictory arguments from both sides, whether it be Chinese scholars, American scholars. But like she said, the environment, creating it hostile. There's two ways that China could go with it. Like yesterday, Professor Jacob talks about in his article in The Wire, the China has a desire to, project itself as different. So it keeps saying that it will not take the old path. It will discontinue colonization. It will not be doing plundering. It will not accept hegemonism. But it also does use its size and historical influence. So there's a contradictory thing. And China, you can see as domestically also, it does not allow a space for its minorities to voice their opinions. So internationally also, I think this is going to be a game of realpolitik. Nevertheless, the idea, the construction of Tianxia and a Chinese dream is important to understand as how they would want to portray their image to the world.
Okay. Thanks, Dickey. Now I'll request Shruti and Swagata to respond to comments made by discussants very briefly, not more than 2 minutes each. Shruti, you can go ahead first.
Sorry, sir, your voice was breaking.
No, what I was saying that Shruti, you can respond to comments made by Professor Sharma very briefly in 2 minutes.
Okay, ma'am has highlighted the point that I should of Xi Jinping and how his rise in China has will impact um, India's and Vietnam's hedging strategy. So I will like to work on this aspect of uh, Manorama Sharma's comment on this.
Okay. Okay. Swagata would like to
Yes.
come in? Yeah.
Yes. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Sharma for her constructive comments on my paper, and I would really like to deep dive into foreign policy, Indian activist foreign policy. And I agree there with Professor Sharma that Northeast is an indispensable part of accommodating any kind of Chinese overtures towards Myanmar. That has to be accommodated. And since this question about ideology and its relevance was posed to all the participants and presenters, here I would like to add that while ideology and theories are the mold in which our foreign policy actions are born and assessed, at the same time, it also there is pragmatism, the politics of pragmatism beyond ideology, and we have seen time and again how regimes have twisted ideologies to suit the pragmatic environment. So that way, ideology and its application, or theories and its application, is bound to be dynamic in international politics, and we have to always switch or kind of find a midway between ideologies to understand and properly evaluate current situation in politics. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me, in my concluding remarks, offer some very quick comments on 3 papers, more in the nature of suggestions. Dickey Lama has brought out, the evolution, the concept of Tianxia, but how it applies to Kyaukpyu port, Kyaukpyu as a manifestation of Tianxia 2.0, I think that perhaps needs to be reinforced a little bit. Shruti's paper on hedging as a viable strategy for India and China for dealing with the China challenge, I think it might be useful to bring out also a different, how India and Vietnam are differently placed with regard to China. For India, you can't really exclude balancing as part of its response to China. Indeed, neither Vietnam nor India is interested in bandwagoning with China. But to what extent hedging can be a viable strategy for India as distinct from balancing, I think that they can perhaps be explored further. Swagata, no, it's a very good paper, but as Professor Sharma brought out, I think the aspect of activist policy of India and to what extent China's privileged list Myanmar comes in their actualization of activist policy can be explored further. You are focused mainly on 2 aspects, citizenship and connectivity. Perhaps you may also like to look at security as a dimension, because when it comes to our dealings with Myanmar, India's dealings with Myanmar, that's a very major concern, not only in context of insurgent groups based in Myanmar, many of which get support from China, but also China's efforts to find access to Bay of Bengal through Kyaukpyu port, and how it impacts India's security calculus as also its activist policy. There are some other aspects we can discuss later, but let me conclude here by saying that we had 3 very good papers, very interesting papers, from 4 scholars, which have provided interesting perspectives and excellent comments coming from Professor Manorama Sharma, which will no doubt help the scholars in finalizing their papers. Let me thank the speakers as also the discussant for their contributions and comments which came from the floor that were also very helpful. Thank you very much. Let's conclude this session now.
Thank you so much, sir. With this, we come to a very fruitful ending to the third thematic panel of the 15th AICCS. I express my sincere gratitude to the chair, the discussant and the speakers for their remarks and for patiently addressing the questions and comments posed by the audience. I also express my sincere gratitude to the audience. We hope you will also find time to attend our next session, which is a special lecture on mobile attraction, traveling film projectionists and rural cinema exhibition in Mao's China. It is set to commence at 1800 hours IST. Thank you and have a good day.